Welcome back to the greenhouse. What I want to talk about this time is taking dahlia cuttings in the autumn as against the spring to actually keep the plants going over the winter. Now many of you may ask, well, what on earth do you want to take cuttings in the autumn for? Well, in this occasion I want to take cuttings because I particularly want a certain variety and it's not widely available. So a friend of mine said, well, why don't you take some cuttings off my plants before I dig them up for the winter and keep them going over the winter. So that's what I'm going to do. Now I've done it with other plants in previous lives and when I've been interested in other things, but I've never done it with dahlias before. So it's the same sort of theory as I demonstrated for taking cuttings in the spring. So let's show you what I've done. I took these cuttings about 3 hours ago. I had to drive and fetch them, cut them off the plants belonging to this friend of mine, and as you can see I took them fairly long because I thought, well, they'll probably dry out, and as you can see that one actually has healed over. I bet they all have, but they've been sealed in a plastic bag to keep them as good as I can. Now this time of year it's very difficult to take cuttings without having flower buds involved in them. So if you look at this one, there's quite a decent bud on there, and there's another one coming. So I've got my good old Swan Morton scalpel out again, same thing that I use in the summer. I've put a new blade in it because the other one, the sap had sent the blade a bit rusty and a bit grotty. So I'll start with that one and then I'll go through and clean all the rest of them up and we'll start doing some cuttings. Now if you remember back to taking cuttings in the spring, I discussed whether you could take cuttings when the stems were hollow. Well, I think at this time of the year you'd find it very difficult to find a plant that hasn't got hollow stems. So we'll take these, see how they go on and see how they grow. These are a variety that I particularly want, so it's worth the risk. I'm going to start them off in the normal trays, okay, 12 to a tray, using the usual mixture for compost of growing medium. So 1 part sharp sand, 1 part vermiculite and 1 part seed compost. Now the seed compost, if you remember from the spring programme, was specifically nutrient free for growing cuttings and starting seeds off, so there was no added nutrients, it was just finely ground peat. So that's the usual mixture. Let's have a look and see what we can do with these cuttings. I'll just do a couple of them, save boring you to death. I'll do the rest and then we'll move on to actually planting them. So that has got to come off. We don't want a flower bud on. Good old Swan Morton scalpel to make sure that everything is as cleanly cut and as sterile as possible. We don't want to introduce any germs. So the bud comes off, the 2 side shoots come out. Those were buds actually that were forming, and then we're going to take these leaves off, that one and that one, to reduce the cutting down. I'm actually, because it's over winter, we don't really want the plants to go ahead too quickly, but I want them to actually remain damp. So if I'm going to cut the leaves in half to get rid of some of the greenery, because a plant, and specifically a cutting like this, loses water through its leaves. It's called transpiration. It's rather like humans do when they sweat, but they actually give up moisture through their leaves. So there we go. It's a nodal cutting, not an internodal cutting. It's a nodal cutting, so we need to cut across where those leaf axils came out of, and hopefully not cut my hand as well. Okay, that's fairly tough. It's not like taking a cutting in the spring. And there you are. You can see there that that's actually hasn't got a hollow right up through there, so let's hope that that gets going. So let's do another one quickly. There we go, that's got a bud on we don't need. I have a feeling I'm going to have to revisit this one because there's 2 buds coming there in those leaf axils. Now there's one gone. There's the second one gone. Okay, so those leaves are pretty good. Let's take those off out of the way. There we go. Whoops, left a bit behind. And then cut them across. So there's the healed over main stem. I cut them long so that I would actually be able to play around with them. There we go. There's another one taken. Okay, that's a bit of the remnant of one I've already done. And here's another one. So take the leaves off there, and then I'm going to cut just below the leaf axil. There we are. So let's see how they go on. I'll do the rest of this bag and then I'll plant some up. In fact, well, probably better plant them up sooner rather than later, otherwise they'll dry out again. So let me just throw those out of the way. Popping compost in, a bit of autumn leaf, there we go. See, it's a nice sandy open mixture. There we are, and I'll come back in just a few minutes when I've prepared this further. Right, I've prepared a dozen cuttings now, so I'll do a single half tray just to start off. I'll do the rest of them, so there's loads in the bag there. I'm only actually expecting to probably get 40%, maybe 50% rooted if I'm lucky. So I'll do plenty, and to be honest, if I only get 2 or 3, that'll be fine by me. It's a variety that I want, it's a variety I can't buy, so it doesn't really matter. I'm just going through making holes in the compost ready to pop the cuttings into. Actually that one could do with some of the leaves taking off to stop it losing moisture, quite so much moisture, so take that off. Okay, I'll sweep the floor up afterwards. Now, why would you, other than if it's a variety that you can't get your hands on that you particularly want to grow, why else would you want to take cuttings in the autumn? Well, growers who grow lots of dahlias for showing, very often they'll get a sport, a particular shoot come off one of their varieties that they're normally growing, and it will be different to the mother plant. Now that sport, they'll take cuttings in the autumn to keep it going over the winter and to produce tubers the following year, so that they can grow it on to experiment with it and see whether it's worth keeping. So that's a really practical reason, rather than a reason of greed that I particularly want this variety. So usual preparation for the cuttings, usual trays. We'll just dip them in the water, into the hormone rooting powder, and then there we go. Now this time of year, we're 5th of October at the moment, Sunday the 5th of October. The days are shortening, but they're not too bad at the moment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put these actually into the big propagator. Oh, I think we'll have a piece of that leaf off as well. There we go. We'll put these into the propagator, but I'm not going to turn the heat on yet. The temperature at night is going down to 3 or 4 degrees, but here in the greenhouse It's obviously, I think I'll cut that off as well, it's obviously not getting very cold, so I'll pop them in the propagator, but I won't turn the power on, so they'll be in a little sort of warm cocoon, if you like. As the nights get longer and the days get shorter, I shall obviously have to put some bottom heat on. Well, I'm going to see how it goes this week. Our weather up until now here in England has been pretty good in September, but it's about to go downhill rapidly. For this first week in October, we're expecting a lot of wind and rain tomorrow, which means, of course, there won't be much daylight around. It'll be dull all day, so it could well be that within a week or two I'm going to need to start putting some heat under these cuttings, and I'm going to have to put a light in to artificially light them. Now that one, I don't think I'm going to plant that, it's not been cut very well. So there we go, that's the first dozen cuttings taken. So I shall put a grow light over the top of the propagator, and I'll show you all that when it happens. So let's take a bit more of that off. That plant doesn't need those leaves at the moment. What we want it to do is to conserve its energy and conserve its water. And there we go, that can go into the propagator, and hopefully they'll start rooting. Right, so that bag of greenery rendered up 40 cuttings. So there they all are, all planted up, 3 trays of 12, and then 4 in a single pot. I couldn't waste them. They may be the ones that grow, the rest of them might not. So as I said before, I'm really only expecting probably 40%, if I'm lucky, success. But if it only gets down to being just a few, that's okay as far as I'm concerned. I've just been and checked out the propagator that I'm going to put them into, and I was wrong about the temperature. I thought it was quite warm today, and in fact the propagator is showing, or should I say the thermostat for the propagator is showing 20.5 degrees. Now if you remember back to the film about taking cuttings in the spring, 20 degrees is about the optimum. So I've set the thermostat on 20 degrees. We'll start off with a little bit of heat, and I'll monitor it. I won't leave all the vents open like I did in the spring, and we'll see how we go. Now, harking back to the spring film about taking cuttings, one of my friends, who's a very experienced dahlia grower, and he shows a lot all over the country, when he saw the video that I'd produced, he said, "Oh, you've forgotten one thing." And he said, when you're taking cuttings in the spring, take the cutting as close to the tuber as you can. So there's a little addition to the spring film. It's totally irrelevant at this time of the year, but it's something to bear in mind. Take the cuttings as close to the tuber as you possibly can. I suppose it makes sense actually, but there you are. Okay, so I'll pop these into the propagator and we'll see how we fare. Right, so there's the cuttings in the propagator. I've lined the propagator with capillary matting to hopefully improve the sort of dampness of the atmosphere, the humidity in there. But before I leave them and put the lid on, I'm just going to damp them down with a water spray, just to make sure that everything's nice and moist. And then I will come up every day and make sure that they're all right. One thing I didn't mention was, as I went through each of these cuttings, I made sure there were no aphids present, and as far as I could tell there were no eggs present, because unlike taking cuttings in the spring, of course these have been out in the open air, in the garden, on the allotment, or wherever you've been growing them, and of course they're open to all sorts of pests and aphids and so on. So in fact I've killed a few greenfly while I've been preparing these cuttings, but and there was one or two contorted leaves where something had obviously laid some eggs, so I just cut those off and got rid of them. So I think I will be regularly visiting these, because the chance of having some pests amongst them is fairly high, and of course there are quite a few buds just forming, flower buds just forming, so I'm going to have to go through them fairly regularly and take those off, because we don't want flowers sapping the energy of the cuttings. So there we go. I'll come back to these in a few days' time and we'll see how they're rooting, or not. It's 25th of October and there's an eerie light showing from the greenhouse. It's only 6:30 in the evening, but I've put a grow lamp into the greenhouse so that the dahlia cuttings can have a longer period of light. I've set it so that it actually goes off on a timer at 11 o'clock at night, so they're having the equivalent of daylight from 8 in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. So that's 15 hours of daylight. They've been in for 3 weeks now. Well, it'll be 3 weeks tomorrow that I planted the cuttings, so we'll have a look in the next day or two and see if they've rooted yet. But let's just go and have a quick look in the greenhouse and see what this peculiar light's doing. Inside the greenhouse, the eerie light, which actually through the viewfinder looks fairly white rather than the purple that was showing from the outside. Anyway, it's a bit of a Heath Robinson contraption. I've just plugged it into the mains and put it on a timer, and then it's strung from the struts of the greenhouse with string. Bit of a Heath Robinson affair, but just put together to see how it works, and it seems to be working quite well. The plants actually look very well, so I'll go and take the top off and we'll have a quick look inside now. So there's a quick look at the grow lamp. It's 225 LEDs, so it's a very low powered affair. It's one that I bought off the internet. It didn't cost very much, really, because I was only experimenting. So let's just have a quick look at the plants. And there you are. There's 40 plants there that have been in for, well, it'll be 3 weeks tomorrow. The propagator has been set up at 20 degrees centigrade. That's what I would normally use in the spring, and as you can see, they all look very well. There is a small incidence of mildew. I assume it's because of the still air and so on, so I've opened all the ventilators on the propagator, and I've been taking the lid off every morning and putting it on every evening, really just to give a better flow of air. Now you'll notice over on the right there is actually a watering can in the propagator. At the moment there's only these 40 plants in here, so I've put a watering can in here so that when I do water them, and I do do it every 2 or 3 days, the water's not going to be a cold shock to them. It's actually brought up to the right temperature. So they all look very well. In the next day or two I'll take 1 or 2 out and let's see whether they've been producing roots. Now remember, these were all hollow cuttings, all of them. So let's see whether we've been successful or not. They do look strange though, don't they, with the purple light on green leaves. They look really most peculiar. Anyway, let's come back to them in a day or two. 3 weeks and a day after planting those cuttings, I've just knocked a pot out into the one of the trays in the greenhouse, and as you can see, they've rooted very nicely. So I'll pot those up into singly into just small plant pots, and we'll see how they go on. I'm going to put them back into the propagator just to make sure that they carry on, because we got some cold weather forecast. But as you can see, they're quite a pleasing amount of roots on those 4 plants. Now those were actually planted close together in a plant pot. They were sort of some spare ones, they weren't actually in the trays. So in a few days I'll have a look and see what the ones in the trays are doing. First off, I'll have a look on the underside and see if there's any roots showing through the bottom. But there we go, quite pleasing, especially at this time of the year. And those were all hollow cuttings. It's the 7th of November, a very miserable, wet, cold afternoon, and I've come to have a look and see how these have rooted. If you cast your mind back to what they were like when I first planted them, you'll see they've grown very well. So let's get them out of the trays and see what they're like. That's 2 of the trays. Now something that I was doing that I didn't say anything about was, one of the trays I used rooting powder, hormone rooting powder with the cuttings, and the other 2 trays I didn't. So let's see what the difference is. That tray on the right, I didn't use any hormone rooting powder. The tray on the left, I did. So if we have a look first and see what they're like with the rooting powder. Well, those look pretty good to me, nice roots, and the plant's going quite well. Now I should just remind you that of course the cuttings were all hollow stemmed. Let's try another one at random, see what this one's like. Oh yeah, very good, plenty of roots, looks like it's going to go on okay. Alright, so those are going to get potted on probably tomorrow. It's going to be raining again tomorrow, I'm told. So let's have a look and see what the cuttings are like when I didn't use any rooting powder. Oh no, this is going to pull out of the compost. Well, there you go, that's not too bad. That'll go on okay. Not quite as good a root system as the ones that had hormone rooting powder, but not bad. Let's just pop that to one side and try another one. Oh, that's not very good. Well, it started. So you can see that using hormone rooting powder does have an effect, but with the look of it they're going to go okay, so it shouldn't be a problem. Now it's quite interesting on this tray here to note how that's gone up. That plant has grown quite well. So as you can see there, having started these off in the autumn, I'll leave that for a minute. Having started these off in the autumn, there are actually going to be more cuttings ready through the winter. So I think this will be an ongoing process. Anyway, I'm going to pot those up all into small pots like this, the usual pots that I use, the square ones, so they don't take up too much room. And then when they've all been potted up, I'm going to turn the temperature down in the propagator. At the moment it's set at 20 degrees to get them, really encourage them to get going. Now they've rooted and are really underway very nicely, I'm going to turn the temperature down because I don't really want them to grow very much. I just want them to sort of set roots and just tick over the winter. Obviously in the spring when the temperature rises, and I've actually got the heating on in the greenhouse, I haven't at the moment, There's only a few other bits and pieces in here which will stand a slight frost. At the moment we've only had the one frost so far this winter, but later on in the winter I'll put the heating on in here, and it'll be on a thermostat so that if we do get some cold and frosty weather, things will be able to carry on without any damage. So I'll turn the propagator down to 10 degrees and let these tick over. So there you are. That completes this very short presentation on taking autumn cuttings. I potted the cuttings on, and having taken 40 cuttings originally, 30 of them had carried on and made roots and looked very good. So I potted 30 of them on, which means a 75% success rate, which I'm very pleased with. I didn't expect to have as many cuttings take root as that at this time of the year. So I've now put them back in the propagator. I'm going to turn the temperature down to about 10 degrees, just so that they can rest over the winter. I don't want them growing on fast, I just want them to tick over. So I shall come up here every other day and just make sure they're all right and make sure that they're damp rather than soaking wet. At the moment they're soaking wet because I've just watered them heavily because of putting them into fairly dry compost. But there we are, the conclusion of a fairly successful experiment.